Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at Hermann Lotze.
Okay.
I think this will be really interesting for you since you're a philosopher.
Yeah, definitely.
Lotze was a super prominent philosopher back in the day,
Yeah.
but nobody really reads him now.
Yeah, that's true. He's definitely fallen out of favor.
So we're going to try to figure out why that happened,
Sounds good.
and we'll also dig into what he did contribute, especially in bridging idealism and modern thought.
That's an important part of his work.
We'll be using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on Lotze for this deep dive.
Okay, cool. I'm familiar with that one.
And get this, Lotze's influenced thinkers like Heidegger and Carnap.
Wow, that's quite a range.
Yeah, and even potentially Martin Luther King Jr. and W.E.B. Du Bois.
Really? That's fascinating. I wouldn't have expected that.
So let's dive in.
Okay, let's do it.
To understand how one person could influence such a diverse group of thinkers, we need to start with Lotze's historical context.
Yeah, definitely.
He lived from 1817 to 1881. And during that time, German philosophy was shifting away from Hegel's idealism and towards a more scientific approach.
So he was right in the middle of this huge philosophical transition.
He was, and he was a leading figure in his day, hugely influential.
Right.
But now you'd be hard-pressed to find his work on a philosophy syllabus.
True.
What happened? Was he just a product of his time, or are there deeper reasons why he's been forgotten?
That's the million-dollar question. Well, there are a few possibilities. As philosophy became more specialized, Lotze's approach, which was very broad and eclectic, it might have just fallen between the cracks.
Ah, so he was too much of a Renaissance man for his own good.
Exactly. He didn't fit neatly into any one emerging discipline.
That makes sense.
And his writing style, it was also quite dense and complex.
Oh, so not exactly a light read?
No, not really. Not even for a philosopher.
Okay, so that's a strike against him right there. I mean, if you're competing for attention, a challenging style isn't going to win you many fans.
Right. But to really understand Lotze's unique approach, I think it would be helpful to look at a few specific debates that he weighed in on.
Okay, I'm game. Which debates?
Let's look at 3. Polygenicism, panpsychism, and vitalism.
Okay, polygenicism first. For those who might not know, it's the idea that the human races have separate origins.
Right.
This was a pretty hot topic in the 19th century, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. And Lotze's stance was actually quite surprising for his time. You see, he questioned the very concept of race as a biological category.
Oh, wow.
He argued that even if science proved there were differences between groups, it wouldn't justify treating people differently based on their ancestry.
Wow, that's a remarkably progressive view for the 1800s. It seems like he was drawing a clear distinction between scientific facts and moral values.
Absolutely. He was very concerned with finding a place for values and meaning in a world that was increasingly being explained by science. And this concern, it really permeates all of his work.
That's a crucial point.
Yeah.
Okay, so next up is panpsychism. This is the idea that consciousness is fundamental to all matter. So did Lotze buy into this idea?
Well, he was clearly intrigued by it, but he ultimately saw panpsychism as more of an aesthetically pleasing idea than a scientifically sound one.
Ah, so he appreciated the beauty of it, but wasn't quite ready to commit fully.
Exactly. He loved the idea of a unified living form, but he also always wanted to stay grounded in rigorous scientific inquiry.
That makes sense.
Thank
Okay,
you.
what about vitalism? That's the belief in a special life force, right?
That's right. And this is where Lotze made one of his major contributions. He actually argued against the concept of a separate vital force. He advocated instead for a more, mechanistic understanding of biological processes.
Interesting. So was that controversial at the time?
It was a pretty big departure from the mainstream thinking, and his work in this area really helped pave the way for a more materialist understanding of biology.
It's kind of ironic, isn't it? He was opposed to materialism as a philosophical perspective.
Yeah, it is.
But by dismantling vitalism, he inadvertently aided the very perspective he disagreed with.
That's a great point. I think it's a really good example of just how complex and nuanced his thinking was.
Yeah, for sure. So in these 3 controversies, we see Lotze grappling with these fundamental questions about science,
Right.
about values, the nature of reality and consciousness.
Yeah. And as we'll see, these themes, they run through all of his major contributions to philosophy.
Okay, well, let's move on and see what those contributions were.
Sounds good. All right, so let's dive into some of Lotze's more lasting contributions to philosophy.
Okay, sounds good.
I think there are like three key areas where he made a real impact. We can look at his work on intuition and space,
Okay.
his ideas about thought and language,
Okay.
and then his pretty unique concept of being.
Okay, so starting with intuition and space. I know Lotze had a background in medicine and physiology.
Right.
Did that inform his work in this area?
It definitely did. See, Lotz was really trying to understand how our minds, which he believed to be non-spatial, could perceive a world that so clearly exists in space.
Yeah, that's a tough one. How do you bridge that gap?
Right, so to tackle this, he developed this theory of local signs.
Local signs, what are those?
Okay, so he proposed that our senses, they don't just gather information about like the qualities of objects, but also, and this is key, they gather these subtle cues about their location.
Okay,
And these cues, which he called local signs, they're non-spatial in themselves.
I see.
But our minds use them to construct a spatial representation of the world.
So it's like our senses provide this coded message about space,
Yeah.
and our minds have the key to kind of decipher it.
Precisely. It's like this brilliant way to try and reconcile the seemingly incompatible realms of mind and matter.
Yeah, like that.
And you know, this idea is actually still relevant today. Think about contemporary cognitive science and all the debates about how we perceive space. Lotz's theory of local signs was kind of like a precursor to a lot of those discussions.
It's always amazing to me how these ideas from the 19th century, they can still be relevant to modern research.
It's true.
Okay, let's move on to Lotz's ideas about thought and language.
Okay.
I know he saw the mind as an active participant in shaping our understanding of the world,
Right.
similar to, like, Kant in a lot of ways.
He did. Lotze really went beyond the traditional empiricist view of the mind as this kind of passive receiver of sensations. He saw thought as like this active process of construction, not just the association of ideas.
Okay.
And for Lotze, language plays this like really crucial role in this whole process.
So it's not just that we use language to express our thoughts, but that language actually shapes how we think.
Exactly. Lotze believed that the structure of language,
Okay.
things like grammar and syntax, they influence how we conceptualize the world around us.
Interesting.
And he even warned about the potential for language to create, like mythologies that can distort our understanding of reality.
Super relevant today. Yeah, absolutely, especially with the rise of, misinformation and propaganda. It's like language can be this tool for clarity,
Right.
but also like a weapon of deception.
Yeah, it's both. He was very aware of the power of language.
It seems like it. Okay, so now let's talk about his concept of being.
All right, being. Probably like the most challenging aspect of his work.
Well, as a philosopher, I'm ready to dive into those deep metaphysical waters.
Okay, great. So for Lotze, to understand his view on being, you kind of have to remember what he was dealing with philosophically.
Yeah.
He was trying to figure out how to reconcile the idea of a unified, meaningful reality
Okay.
with this increasingly scientific worldview that was emerging.
Yeah, makes sense.
He rejected that traditional view of being as simply, existing out there in the world.
Okay.
For Lotze, being is fundamentally about relationships and this interconnectedness of everything.
So it's not about isolated things just existing independently, but how everything relates to each other and forms a whole.
Exactly. And this led Lotze to a form of monism,
Monism.
which in philosophy, you know this, it's the belief in the unity of all things.
Right.
Lotze believed that everything is ultimately interconnected, like it all forms this single unified reality.
That's a pretty heady concept.
Yeah.
How did he account for all the diversity and the, apparent separateness we experience in the world if everything is one?
Right. Well, that's where his concept of God comes in.
Oh.
For Lotze, God is this ultimate ground of reality, like the source of all this interconnectedness.
I see.
He saw God as a personal being who brings unity and meaning to the universe.
So for Lotze, understanding being wasn't just about grasping these abstract philosophical concepts,
Right.
but it was about understanding ourselves and our place in the world
Yeah.
and our relationship to a divine personal God.
That's a good way to put it. And, while some of his specific ideas, they might seem a little outdated today,
Okay.
his core concerns about the relationship between science, values, and the human person,
Yeah.
I think those are more relevant than ever.
It seems like he was a thinker ahead of his time in a lot of ways.
He was.
Yeah.
And even though he's not as well known today, his legacy kind of lives on in how we think about these big questions.
Okay, so Lotze was this incredibly insightful philosopher, grappled with these huge questions, and tried to bridge that gap between idealism and a more scientific worldview.
Right.
But it seems like his work has been largely forgotten.
Yeah, sadly it has.
So how are his ideas still alive today, even if people don't really know his name?
Well, you're right. His name might not be as familiar, but his ideas, they've had a real ripple effect.
Okay.
We can still see his influence in how we talk about monism,
Okay.
personalism,
Uh-huh.
and even the nature of value itself.
Let's unpack those a bit. So we already talked about how Lotze arrived at his view of monism.
Right.
That everything is ultimately part of one unified reality. How did this influence later thinkers?
Well, Lotze's version of monism, with this emphasis on this interconnectedness and the idea of a personal God as the ground of reality, that really had a strong influence on, like, the British idealists.
Okay, so even though he was working within the German philosophical context, his ideas kind of found a home in other traditions as well.
They did.
Okay, what about personalism? How did his work contribute to that school of thought?
Well, personalism, it emphasizes the centrality of the person. That the person is the fundamental unit of reality.
Okay.
And this idea really owes a lot to Lotze. He saw each person as a being with this inherent value and dignity.
And that idea of inherent dignity.
Right.
That connects really strongly to the work of Martin Luther King Jr., doesn't it?
It's a fascinating link. We can't say definitively that Lotze directly influenced King,
Okay.
but the parallels are pretty striking.
Yeah.
They both emphasize this moral imperative to treat all individuals with respect and to recognize their inherent worth.
It's like these philosophical ideas, they don't exist in a vacuum.
No, they don't.
They can have a really big impact on how people view the world and how we treat each other.
Absolutely.
Okay, so then there's Lotze's work on the nature of value. It seems like this is where he really pushed back against a lot of the prevailing trends of his time.
He did.
So how did he approach the concept of value?
Well, he believed that value, they weren't just like these subjective preferences.
Okay.
He argued that they're objectively grounded in reality.
So not just that we happen to find certain things valuable,
Right.
but that there's some kind of deeper objective basis for value in the universe itself.
Exactly. And this idea actually connects to W.E.B. Du Bois.
Oh, really?
His arguments about the cultural contributions of African Americans.
Right.
Du Bois really challenged the view that African American culture was somehow inferior or lacking in value.
Right.
He argued that African Americans had made these unique and valuable contributions to art, music, literature.
And it sounds like Lotze's philosophy, with its emphasis on this objective value, it could have provided a framework for Du Bois' claims.
Yeah, it's a really interesting connection. Both thinkers were pushing back against this worldview that devalued certain groups of people and their cultures.
Yeah.
They were arguing for a more inclusive understanding of value.
So if Lotze has been largely forgotten, why should we care?
Yeah.
What makes him relevant to us today?
Well, his work reminds us that philosophy, it's not just this, academic exercise.
Okay.
It's a living tradition that deals with these fundamental questions about what it means to be human.
Right.
And while some of his specific ideas might seem outdated,
Yeah.
his core concerns, I think, about the relationship between science and values and the human person, they're more relevant than ever.
It seems like he was wrestling with how to hold on to meaning and purpose in a world that was increasingly dominated by science. And that's something we still struggle with today.
We do. And perhaps, most importantly, Lotze reminds us about this interconnectedness of all things.
Yeah.
That we're all part of something larger than ourselves.
That's a really powerful message, especially in a world that often feels so fragmented and divided.
It is.
So maybe Lotze was asking the right questions, even if some of his answers might not completely satisfy us today.
Yeah, I think that's right. And those are the kinds of questions that, they stay with us long after we finished reading.
They do.
So even though his name might not be on everyone's lips, Lotze's work, I think, it still has the power to challenge us.
Yeah.
To provoke us to think deeply about ourselves and our place in the world.
Well, I think you've convinced me that Lotze deserves another look. Thanks for taking us on this deep dive.
You're welcome.
And to all of you listening out there, we hope you enjoyed this philosophical journey as well. Until next time.